Okay, so let me start. I want to introduce our moderator for this next panel, which is on catalyzing the private sector, what firms and entrepreneurs need. We have, if folks can, if you have a conversation, maybe you can take it outside. If we can get going on the next panel, that'd be good. So we've been talking a lot this morning about the role of government, and it's critical to understand if we're going to have the right policies by government, we need to understand what is it that the private sector is doing and what kinds of things they need from the government for them to be successful and drive innovation, because fundamentally it's going to be them who are going to be putting these things in the marketplace. So we have a great moderator, Amanda Little, who has published widely on the environment, energy, and technology for more than a decade. She wrote Muckraker, a long-running syndicated weekly column on grist.org and salon.com, and a number of other areas and places, and also is an award-winning journalist. But she's also the author of a book which I encourage you to read, Power Trip, The Story of America's Love Affair with Energy, which I guess just the paperback came out a month ago or so. So it's a good Christmas stocking gift on Amazon. Power Trip is, quote by the Times of London, is faster, funnier, smarter, and more Amanda is faster, funnier, smarter, and more tenacious than anyone else. Little has a big voice and tells her story with style. J.P. Morgan chose Power Trip for its 2010 reading list, and Bill McKibben talked about energy's most important story. No one's ever told it with more verb than Amanda, so she's hopefully can talk maybe a little bit about what her book says as well, but and moderate this panel. So thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much. Am I tapping in here? Great. Well, Andy, I was so inspired by your verve up here, standing up. I'm going to start out up and maybe move down. But we've heard from seasoned public officials and scholars, and now it's time to hear from the scrappy guys in the private sector. They are innovators in solar, smart tech, large-scale utilities, and venture capital. And they're all of them working in this creative white space between policy and innovation. And we want to find out what these guys need to do their best work. Number one here is Will Coleman. He's a partner with Mohr Davidow Ventures, focusing on energy and clean tech investing. He also worked as a legislative director for Renewables Coalition, promoting innovative energy legislation. He worked at GE Wind. He's on the advisory board for the group that operates the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Also on the advisory committee for California Energy Commission's Alternative and Renewable Fuel and Vehicle Technology Program. He sits on the board of the Clean Economy Network, and I could go on and on, but obviously very knowledgeable fellow. Lincoln Hoewing is Vice President of Internet and Technology Policy at Verizon Communications. I'm sure you've all heard of Verizon Communications. He is working in smart tech, and Verizon is building broadband networks and devices connecting customers to information about their home energy use. They're involved in business energy management solutions and consumer services for home energy management. But Lincoln also has done a lot of work in the public sector. He served as a deputy staff director on the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, congressional legislative aide, and he also worked with Bell Atlantic and Telecom. Brian Sager founded Nanosolar in 2001. You've probably all heard of this rock star in third generation solar innovation, or fourth generation. He manages the company's government programs, strategic partnerships, and intellectual property. And he's also a principal investigator for research contracts with the Department of Defense and DARPA, Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, and so on. Nanosolar has 96 patents, but what interested me most about Sager's profile is that he earned a PhD in biochemistry, and he also raised $500 million. I would say that makes him a true modern Renaissance man. And last but not least, Bill Tyndall is Senior Vice President of Federal Government and Regulatory Affairs at Duke Energy. Duke serves 4 million customers and is evidence that titans of industry can be nimble and extremely forward-thinking. He served as Managing Director at NatSource, which advised companies on how to reduce emissions, was also at Synergy Corporation. He has worked closely with government regulators over the years. He was a member of the EPA's Clean Air Advisory Committee and a counsel on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce to Congressmen Dingell and Waxman, among much, much else. So lots of exciting wisdom to be learned in the next 45 minutes. But let's start with the state of play. Just quick comments from all of you on what you're most excited about and most concerned about in the energy sector. What are the signs of progress and paralysis that concern and hearten you most? Starting with Will.
So we come at it from a venture perspective. So obviously we look at it through the eyes of entrepreneurs and sort of the early stage of innovation. And I think that, you know, in terms of the state of play, we've obviously seen a huge run-up in the last 7 or so years in terms of clean tech. And we've seen, you know, it was predicated on $140 a barrel of oil in 2008. But when we first got in the game, it was only $40 a barrel of oil. And so, you know, there's a big delta there, and there's a lot of room to play. And I think what heartens us is the fact that when we started making investments, it was really that low. We obviously, at $80 a barrel of oil, have a lot of room to play. And you know, in terms of what's going on in the ecosystem at large, you know, I think we saw a lot of people come into the space. We saw a lot of capital flow into the space. We've seen hundreds of companies started now. If you go and look at the logo list out there that any one of these groups will put up on the screen, you'll see that there's an enormous number of companies doing really interesting things. And I think the challenges are going to be around what the next stages of investment are for those guys, and where the capital comes from, and whether it's here in the U.S. or whether it's somewhere else. And so, you know, I think the biggest challenge we face is that the world is moving by us, and it always appalls me, I guess is the right word, when I come back to D.C. and you walk into the halls of Congress and you don't see the same sense of urgency that we feel out in California, which is, if we don't do it today, somebody in China or India or somewhere else is going to do it. And I think the good news about that is somebody's going to do it. That a lot of these technologies, you know, the horse has left the barn, and they're going to get done. They're on the precipice. They're extremely competitive in a whole lot of different settings, and some are falling rapidly behind. I think the disheartening thing about that is that it's not clear to me that we're going to be doing it here in the U.S. and that we're going to be building it here in the U.S. And so I think we'll talk a little bit more about what needs to happen here in order to see that happen. But to me, that's the big balance.
What's your thought on this? What makes you excited and scared?
Well, this morning I didn't want to be critical of listing all the comments, but a lot of what I heard this morning was the problems and challenges we faced, and it was very negative in some ways. I actually think in our industry there's been a heck of a lot that's come together the last 15 to 20 years that promises a lot of innovation in the energy management space. And I'll just give you a quick vignette. I started in 1994 with Bell Atlantic, and I was actually on a smart home project in 1994. The technologies we used were ISDN, which has, you probably don't even know what it is today, but it was so slow as a network technology that it doesn't even qualify as dial-up hardly today. That was what we were using. The computers we used did not have web capability because that wasn't even something people knew about then. And all the networking we had in the house was basically all hardwired. It had to be specially built. The house itself had to be specially built. Think about where we are today. We now have devices that you can carry around, and iPads and tablet devices that you can see things automatically on that are networked in the house. Almost 60% of the houses have their own home network already. So connecting these people to their own devices is not that hard. Sensor technology has come huge amounts of ways. So you can actually put sensors in all kinds of devices in the home and actually sense what they're doing, what kind of energy usage they have, and so forth. So those kinds of things have made a major advance. Beyond that, we also have all kinds of broadband technologies today that are very, very fast. We just began to build LTE 4th generation wireless technology. We just started it here in Washington and 30 other cities. It has a capability of about 12 to 15 megabits down and 5 megabits up. So you're going to have a huge amount of capacity to be able to do all kinds of energy management technologies. I think the potential is there. I think what was missing, and we're a connection company, so we believe in this strongly, is collaboration is what makes a lot of this happen. And I'm seeing that happen a lot. I think the other representative here from Duke will talk about that too, but we're doing a lot of work already with energy companies, and I think potential is there. I think we're tipping point, frankly, and we're going to see a lot of progress.
Great. Brian.
The solar industry is particularly close to grid parity in many respects. I know grid parity is not a single number, but retail grid parity in high insulation areas around the world, around the equator, not just Nanosolar, but other companies as well, are on the cusp of this. So that's what's very exciting. What's a little challenging is the public policy, not only in the United States, but elsewhere, and the lack of harmonization and the lack of thought that really goes into that. And there's really two aspects to that. One is stability. It's very hard to ramp to high production volume with anything unless the policy is stable. I'm not even saying what that policy is, but if we can't predict what it's going to be from year to year, or if it's going to switch radically with every election cycle, it's really hard to build a business. So we need policy that transcends election cycles. That's the first point. The second point is we need a balance between supply and demand side policy. So right now, the solar industry is heavily focused, I personally think too much so, on demand generation. And the renewable portfolio standards are a piece of that, investment tax credits are a piece of that. There's nothing wrong with that, but when you stimulate demand and you don't stimulate domestic supply, you've just created a massive economic stimulus package for China. And I'm not sure U.S. taxpayers really want to do that. So I'm not saying that we should get rid of the demand. We need to have both. But the question is, what's the right balance point? I'm not here to argue for a tuned point, but rather to suggest we should engage in a constructive framework thinking about what that might be and how to balance between supply and demand side in a way that transcends election cycles, and that'll allow all the innovation that's on the cusp of coming out from all the entrepreneurial activity that's been going on in the last 10 to 15 years in solar and really begin to have an impact on the energy economy globally.
Great, and hopefully we'll get into some details about that. And
Bill.
Bill.
So I was sitting here and I was trying to think, okay, you got to be positive, got to be positive. I just spent 2 years trying to pass a climate bill. That didn't go very well. So it's, trying to look at this from the point of view of an incumbent, mature, representing vertically integrated, state-regulated. The challenges of innovating are very, very challenging, and we love our regulators, but we've tried to do all sorts of different things, from energy efficiency to smart grid to trying to do new types of technologies, and and in our world it's both a technological challenge and it's a regulatory challenge. But I come out of this optimistic. We do need policies. We are losing the international wars in terms of keeping these technologies or developing these technologies domestically. My CEO, who was supposed to be sitting in this chair, is actually sitting at the White House with 19 other business leaders, where he didn't get a minute with President Obama. They had 6 hours. So we spend more time trying to figure out what the heck he talked about for that long, rather than you have 1 hour, you have 1 minute with the president. What do you say? But there's tremendous opportunity to drive these technologies forward, to integrate them all. We could be at a tipping point, but the worst thing we could be at is sort of a muddle, which I have to say I might worry about a little.
I was going to ask you all to imagine this 1 minute or 15 minutes with, or an hour, let's say, with the president and congressional leaders. But since Andrew already played out that experiment, let's imagine that your children begging your parents for some policy measures to catalyze innovation in the near term. Let's just limit it to 3. What would be your 3 requests in that minute with your with leaders or parents, with the impassioned tone of a desperate child?
So we sort of knew this question was coming, and so in anticipation of that, I thought it would be interesting to actually put up a slide which is really focused on where the challenges. So you have to know what the issue is before you know what solutions you want to propose. And I thought it would be useful just for you to all to understand how we see the challenge in terms of gaps out there. And this is really the challenge to scaling innovation and deploying innovation. This isn't, the whole question. But the point is that the way we see capital flow into any one innovation is sort of like this. You see capital flow into basic science early on, and there's a lot of it that goes in there that doesn't necessarily turn into a given innovation because it's basic science, and we need that to happen. And then you see applied science, there's a little less capital. The first gap that we see out there is really around that handshake between the applied science and commercialization. And we see this whole spectrum in 3 stages. You have R&D, scaling and deployment, or scaling, and then you have deployment. And where we squarely sit as ventures is in that scaling portion. And so I think it's useful to see that you have this one gap early on that we see, which is firming up the idea that this is a commercial enterprise and how it's a commercial enterprise and what the value is. The second one is really when you start to get to the point where you got to demonstrate these technologies. And that's where capital starts to outstrip the capacity of venture capital, and you see some of the later stage guys are unwilling to come into that scale of technology risk. And then the last is that first commercial plant. And there are solutions out there that we've talked about before that hit all of these things. And the first, I think, which is critically important, is ARPA-E goes after that first gap. And I think we really need to support ARPA-E in terms of the list of things we'd ask for. In terms of the second gap and the third gap, those kind of combine. And we haven't seen something that hits the second gap. We've seen loan guarantee program, which was ideally suited for that second gap. It was supposed to be oriented towards this early innovation, but because of the way that risk profiles work and the way that the government works in a lot of ways, it skews later. It skews towards less risk. There's no upside in taking more risk when you're a government entity. And so inherently that means they're going to do more conservative things. The challenge is structuring a loan guarantee program in the long term that does skew towards more risk, that actually takes sufficient risk to fill that gap as opposed to duplicating what the private market will do. So in terms of that, the proposal we've seen is through a CETA, which is the Clean Energy Development Administration, and that would be something that would allow them to do a whole bunch of different things in this domain. And then the third is really around that deployment. And I think the issue there is that, Brian mentioned it, that we need the market side stuff to drive things. We really do need stable long-term markets, because the fundamental thing for investors to come in, as was said in the prior panel, is a big market that can be disrupted, and that's critical, that can be disrupted, i.e. that the incumbents don't just own and can't just shut you down when you're trying to enter, and then teams that will come in and innovate around technologies that can be deployed in that market. And so the first thing is that stable market. The second thing is filling the pipeline on the R&D side, and the third thing is helping us in terms of scaling these technologies into the marketplace.
Great, and that summation at the end was perfect, setting the model for the rest of the comments. Go ahead, Link.
So I think there are 3 things that would be useful. One is focus on inputs. So when you're talking about companies that have to make long-term investments, networks that take 10, 15 years to actually mature and actually get a return on, you need to focus on the inputs. And in our case, a big one right now is spectrum. So trying to find a way to make sure we get more spectrum, get into the market so companies can actually have enough spectrum to actually build networks that can have the capacity to offer the kinds of services that we're talking about is really important. And although the government is now focused on that as an issue, I don't think we still have a policy framework yet that says how that's going to happen, how the spectrum is going to be released, how it's going to be available to the private sector. So that's one area, is looking at inputs. The second is capital and how it's used in the industry. In our industry, again, it's a long-term investment proposition. And if you look at the policies in terms of investment that have been in government the last 5 or 6 years, they've changed a lot. And the uncertainty of that is critical when you're talking about long-term investment. So this present tax bill, for example, that's being considered right now has an expensing provision in there that would allow you to expense, in other words, to write off very quickly a lot of your investments in high-tech technologies like fiber and like broadband technology. So, and that, again, is because of the uncertainty, it's very difficult to plan, and you're talking about long-term investment. So that's the second thing. And then finally is certainty and clarity in the policies. And I worked when I was in the Hill years ago on something called the Sunset Act. And it never got passed. Ed Muskie was leading it, a great, I think, really a very smart leader. One of his ideas was that we would actually have a very focused and constant and carefully processed way to look at policies we already adopted, and also to look at whether they still made any sense anymore. And that was a very complex bill, but the idea was to do this on a regular basis and make sure that we actually looked at whether the results have actually occurred, and then actually decide, do we continue these policies, and if not, what do we do to change them? And I don't know if you saw the Post article this weekend, but essentially the argument was we're just building up statute on top of a statute, and we don't even look at the old ones to see if they conflict, how well they're doing. And a part of it, to be honest with you, since I worked in the Hill, and I'll be critical of it a little bit, is that the process itself is not designed to do that. It's actually designed to be much more political, and we've got to move away from that. So that will help a lot.
Okay, certainty. And Brian?
A collision of cultures is the fundamental issue. I think if you think about what an entrepreneur is, that's an individual who's willing to take a lot of risk and suspend disbelief that what they're working towards might not work, right? And if you think about what a commercial banker is, they don't want to take any risk at all, which is completely makes sense. I wouldn't want to put my money in a bank that wanted to take risk. But if we embrace both those cultures and say they're both legitimate, where they collide is when an entrepreneurial company is trying to access large amounts of capital. The loan guarantee program is one example, as Will pointed out, where if we had a risk profile that was biased more towards what the entrepreneur needs and less towards replicating a commercial banking culture, that would be one way to help. Another way is to think about where else there is a risk-averse banking culture that impacts new product introduction. And for solar, for example, that would be the product warranty concept. Very few products have 25-year warranties like solar. No product has been in the market in solar for 25 years to provide that operating history and still being produced 25 years later, because there's constant innovation at every company. So we have a fundamental conundrum. You have a new product that comes out. The bankers want to see 25 years of history, legitimately so, and there's no way to ever satisfy that. Let's not go in denial about those. Let's embrace both those cultures and say they're both legitimate, but how do we solve them? The key would be a federal-private partnership, a public-private partnership where, for example, the public could take on the backstop of a warranty of a new product for 2, 3, 4 years until there's a sufficient level of statistical data such that that product, whether it's a wind turbine or a solar panel or what have you, electric battery in a car, there's statistical data at that point that de-risks the product from the standpoint of the private insurer. So now a risk-averse entity, like an insurance company, has enough data to say, okay, the product's been de-risked, I will underwrite the insurance. So it's a very simple and very low-cost way, and I'm happy to share this offline with any of you, how to enable entrepreneurs to work with a risk-averse culture and introduce new products to the market. So that is on the product side. The loan guarantees are a way to drop the weighted average cost of capital for factory expansion. Both are needed, and both will help stimulate innovation in the U.S. if we do it right. It can be very, very fiscally prudent, even in difficult economic times.
Interesting.
Picking up on what's been said, it certainly is one issue that I think both the venture capital community has struggled with and companies have struggled with. When you get into more centralized energy solutions, the size of a first project of a new technology can be incredibly expensive, and there's technological risk around it, there's construction risk around it, there's performance risk around it, on how much it's going to be available and everything, and that can be very debilitating to our system, and a lot of companies reach this and then almost fall off a cliff in terms of their ability to take a breakthrough technology like large-scale storage and get it across the finish line. So that solution is not going to happen. Again, everybody's been talking about this. You can go to China and you can watch the state-owned companies each get assigned a technology and told to make it happen, and we do not have that kind of industrial policy. So we need to come up with some sort of public-private partnership that will fill this gap, because our existing commercial tools, our existing government tools don't work. Another tool that we need, it's not that hard to do, but we're entering a time where it's going to be very difficult to get Congress to dictate lots of mandates, to say thou shalt have this renewable standard, or those sorts of things. So what are the alternatives if we want to drive something like energy efficiency? And I think it's trying to use tax policy and other things that seem to still be on the table to create incentives for states to do things. I mean, and that works well with our sort of part of the energy ecosystem, where we can say to a state, look, we'll get this tax credit, it'll go to the benefit of the customers if you allow us to do energy efficiency projects in industrials, which will make them more competitive. It's cheaper than building new plants. So there's those kinds of innovations. It's more blocking and tackling than some of the more dramatic things that I think people are talking about. But it'll avoid building more power plants, it's cheap, it's carbon-free, so we got to, it's sort of an all-of-the-above strategy, but we have to be innovative around the current roadblocks on policy.
So before we drill down into some more specifics about how to design and deploy some of these policy measures you've alluded to, I'm curious, given how capital intensive and training intensive it is to design, for instance, a solar panel or an electric car or a carbon-free coal plant, if that's such a thing is possible, much more so than a Facebook or a Groupon or some of the IT companies we see exploding right now. Is the energy sector destined or doomed to evolve much more slowly than IT? Should we expect that this is just going to be a more sluggish process? Will, since you just touched on this, what do you think?
You mean Bill?
Bill. I've got a Will and a Bill, and it's both Williams.
I think that's right. I spent some years away from being in the middle of this industry and was actually working in a Wall Street, in a small firm that was trying to do venture capital investments. And there is a difference between some of the parts of the energy sector in nuclear power or technology around coal. It is very capital intensive, and the returns are questionable. So we're not, until the technology is proven and the application and the government policies all lined up. So what is happening? China, which is, if you take coal, China, which is has large amounts of coal reserves, is out there working on technology, and Duke's in China partnering with Chinese companies, because we see China at the moment being able to scale some of these technologies faster. It's not necessarily a bad story for the United States. We released a study that showed that if you bring Chinese technology or foreign technology and apply it in a specific energy project, about 70% of the jobs, 70% of the spend is still going to be at the local site. You can't generate electricity in China and bring it to the United States. So our part of the sector, there's still a good news here, but we see innovation happening a lot faster in China than in the United States.
Does that suggest that a centralized approach to innovation is more successful in terms of energy than decentralized? I mean, the U.S. is great as decentralized innovation, not obviously doing a whole lot for centralized innovation. Is that fair to deduce from the success of China's model right now?
I'll quickly just say, I think you can't overgeneralize. So I think some places having a more centralized, directed approach will work. There are other places where the goal is something where having 80 companies trying to get it is going to be more effective, and that will be a winning strategy. So I don't think there's one strategy that applies in every situation, but I do think there's specific problems like CO2 emissions from coal-fired power plants that need solutions, and we need to figure out how we get there, whether with the private sector, whether public, whether combination, whether China, whether international cooperation. But we need to have a plan for solutions.
Got it. And does anyone else want to comment on how quickly the energy sector can evolve relative to the IT sector or the China question?
I'd be happy to. I think that centralized innovation is something of an oxymoron in a sense. Most of the innovation happens at the fringes. If you've got everybody in a herd mentality moving in a straight line, you're going to get conformal thinking, you're not going to get innovation. I think that most of the people who've really innovated have been doing so because they've viewed whatever they've done from a very different perspective. In terms of the pace of innovation, though, especially in energy, it is a difficult slog. It's very science intensive. It takes a lot of experimental work in the energy world, no matter where you are. There's not a lot of predictive models, so there's a lot of empirical work that happens, and it takes a lot of time. But being an optimist, because I'm still around, I have to say that those are all advantages as well. Because once you've gotten through that, suddenly you've got, if you've done it right, an almost impenetrable IP barrier. Yeah. And now you can compete against anyone in the world who's behaving at least in a lawful way. But if they're doing that, then you've got a tremendous advantage. So every short-term setback is a long-term advantage.
So if you are talking about the energy industry as being both production side and the use side, then I think it's probably fair to say there are differences in how those two sides work. We're not involved in producing energy. We're certainly involved in trying to help people manage their lives better with communications. That would include energy. And that's why I mentioned a lot that one of the things when I hear the word innovation that really gets my goat, frankly, is that it tends to be focused a lot on a new invention, something new that somebody hadn't thought of before. If you look historically at most of innovations, they usually are built on other previous innovations. So number one, there usually isn't like a light bulb that comes off. More importantly, a lot of innovation is in business models. It's not in the technology. It's in how you actually package it, how you offer to the consumer, what kinds of information you give the consumer. So just one quick example, there's a lot of survey work now that shows that the way you present information on energy use to the consumer is a huge benefit to how they use the technology. Even things like smiley faces, believe it or not, there's been experiments with that. If you put a smiley face on their energy bill, it's basically saying, hey, you've done a good job of saving energy, they really get it. They understand what that means. The same thing if you say your neighbors actually are doing a better job of managing their energy, here's 3 things you could do to get your energy in line with theirs. This actually does work, and those are business model issues. Those are not innovations in the sense of a new technology, but it's using what we have and to better do what we do. And I think we can do a good job of it. We're starting to see that happen. It's going to take some time, but I think we're getting there.
Hey, Will, I want to hear from you also, and we're going to open it up to audience questions in just a second. But as you respond, I'd also like to hear from you. Not all clean tech industries are evolving at the same pace. Which need the most help and which need the least?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the timing question, I think we do understand that this is not, your next best, chug a beer iPhone app, right? I mean, it doesn't take a little bit of beer and a little bit of pizza and a little bit of money to go and create some new application. It takes a lot more time than that. On the other hand, I think if you go and talk to the venture community, you'll find that there's a whole number of innovations out there and ideas out there that don't take the same amount of time as, say, a supply-side solution. I think that's the big difference, is that when you start talking about supply-side solutions, so building a new technology that's a solar technology, a wind technology, or whatnot, it takes time. And it's one of those things where we think about these things in 20-year lifespans, and the issue is that the amount of capital that has to flow in those kinds of applications is actually similar to the same scale that has to flow into, say, Facebook to drive their servers. The difference is that it's a different timing. So the revenue comes much ahead of that capital in Facebook, and it comes after that capital in clean tech. And so the issue is where the risk and the capital flows into that entity and how you justify the fundraising associated with that large amount of capital. And I think that's what we need to get over. And to your point about where we need help, it's in scaling the kinds of technologies that have that kind of profile. Because we can go as venture capitalists and invest all day long in the O-powers of the world and make plenty of money but not make a damn bit of difference. And the issue is the government needs to come in and play in places where there's a high benefit from accelerating the deployment of that particular technology and where private sector capital can't play. And so, I think you see certain industries where we're on the precipice and doing very well. I think wind and solar and, and to some degree biofuels. I think we continue to need help in scaling some of those technologies. And then there's others where we need massive R&D still. I think on the storage side, we still need a lot of R&D.
Transmission as well, storage and transmission.
Transmission as well. In terms of, there's things like carbon conversion to useful products. There's things like solar fuels. Those things are far out there. They could have massive impacts. We've seen some early science coming out of the labs, but it's science. I mean, it's not. There's no commercial premise there yet. We understand the big picture, but that sort of gets back into the other thing, which is, as long as we see these big markets out there, then we can accept the time frames. So as investors, we can sit there and we can invest in a technology that takes a lot of capital and takes a lot of time, because you're going to get paid for the forward growth of that company. When you have to exit, you're going to be sitting there looking at acquirers or at a public market that sits there and says, what's the total potential size of this company? And when we're talking about energy, we're talking about trillion-dollar markets. And so to the degree that that's within the scope of the potential of this technology, you can see getting rewarded for that at the end of the day, and that's what's going to drive capital into this space. The question is what's going to drive debt into this space, who doesn't play in the equity space, and I think that's a challenge for the government to take on.
Okay, so some questions from the audience. I think I saw a hand over here earlier. Yes, okay.
Do you have any more, please?
Okay. For Will and Brian, given the extent of China's clean tech industrial policy, where does the U.S. still have a comparative advantage? Is it primarily clean tech, intellectual property, or can we compete elsewhere? This is from Taryn Norris.
Yeah. So I would just quickly say, I think, and we were talking about this last night at dinner with a bunch of people here, I actually think that one of the things that's uniquely, that the U.S. is uniquely suited for is innovation. I mean, you know, you look around the world, and I know we tend to fall back on that and sort of say, oh yeah, we're innovative and we're more innovative than the rest of the world and that's going to save us. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think the rest of the world's catching up. But on the other hand, I think that we've got an interesting mix between rule of law, capital structures, and innovation in terms of entrepreneurs and science and universities and national labs that all come together in places like Silicon Valley and Massachusetts and all over the place and increasingly other geographies that's unparalleled. You really can't find it anywhere else. And it's the interaction of all those different entities and the fact that there's actually known pathways to success for deploying capital in that manner that allow us to be competitive. And I think we need to leverage that. We need to unlock that. We need to make sure that the capital at those different stages is able to flow into the space because they see a massive opportunity at the end of the rainbow. Otherwise, we are going to see that leadership in short order.
And
Brian, do you need the question again?
No, I heard the question quite well. I would say that you know, I came as a chemist into the solar industry, and my co-founder was a computer scientist, and we, between us, had not a shred of solar knowledge when we started the company, and that was absolutely essential for our success. If we'd been jaded industry veterans, we would have scared ourselves out of starting it, number one. Number two, we would have been thinking along the lines that everybody else was thinking, and we wouldn't have been able to innovate as well. So you need to be able to take the leap of faith that you can come up with something new and original. From our perspective, as very early stage entrepreneurs, it's the wills of the world, which were really critical. Venture capital firms that were willing to take a bet on people that had an interesting idea, didn't necessarily have a track record, and in fact the track record in that space would have been disadvantageous. From what I've seen in China, that's not how it works. I don't see any chance for that kind of venture risk profile to emerge in that part of the world culturally right now. It may change over time, but I think that's a fundamental advantage of the United States that we can truly leverage in the long term if we keep the venture capital community going. From the entrepreneur's point of view as well, you know, I was able to access folks at the national labs by picking up the phone and going there the next day, and they were a Southwest flight away, and they were immediately accessible, and that was a huge advantage as well. Again, the kind of centralized structure in China doesn't necessarily let that happen. So yeah. I think our disorganization is one of our greatest strengths if we leverage it the right way.
Do you also need the Bills of the world?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was talking about the early stage. From the late stage perspective, once we have a product, we want to test it out with the market. Having folks like Duke who really get it and are willing to be innovators and really try new technologies, there's not that many utilities out there that can do that. So it's the whole value chain, which exists in the U.S. I'm not sure it exists everywhere else quite to that extent.
I agree completely. The only thing I worry about is, and it just goes back to the sort of less glamorous production side, but you know, we have 100 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants that are more than 40 years old that should come offline, will come offline in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, what is the technology that's going to replace it? Are we going to do more fossil fuels right now that without energy policy, without sort of new technologies advanced enough, we are going to probably build natural gas. Is that the right solution? And then there's the whole world is having a nuclear renaissance that the United States is not participating in at the moment. Is that, I mean, maybe that's the right outcome, but these are things on the more, you know, high capital, long lead time production side that are right now are happening by default without policy, without, and that's where you know, I said before, the muddle, that's where I worry that the muddle approach doesn't work. I have great faith in the world of incredibly smart people moving into companies and innovating. I have great faith that, you know, the U.S. will work, that those areas will work out fine for the U.S.
Interesting. And before we move on to the next question, Link, I'm curious, do you think that the U.S. is still the global leader in IT? Do you think that the question, what are our competitive advantages and comparative advantages? Do you think that is still one of our great competitive advantages?
Well, there are two parts to that. One is I think that there is certainly on the long-term R&D piece of this, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the next generations of communications technology, and R&D in that space is important. And that's really what led to a lot of the physics and the mathematics that led to the Internet. And there's actually some evidence now that getting to, for example, really high capacity transmission lines for global distribution of information, we need to do some more research in that space to figure out how to continue to advance fiber optic technology, although it's really advanced a long way. So there is some work that needs to be done there. But in the short term, I think if you look at fourth generation wireless technology, we actually have deployed it in this country faster than almost any other country. Now, there are clearly some concerns about some of the service levels and sometimes the drop calls and things like that. But we're making a lot of advances in cleaning that up. And I think the investments are going forward now in this next generation. And we're going faster than most other countries. So I think we're going to see, in our case, 4G will be available to 98% or something in that range of the population by 2014. And then when you think about the speeds of that, that's faster than DSL, faster than traditional cable modem. So we're going to have a platform there that can do some of the things I just talked about. And the other thing I really feel strongly about is we've done a great job of building the devices and the interaction with those devices. And just think about 10 years ago, all you could do was a mouse and a keyboard. That's all you could do pretty much. Today you got touch screens. Microsoft just came out with a Kinect, which is a great advance, where you basically can just move around and it actually detects your movements. So the ability to interact with the devices and carry them because they're so light and have information with you whenever you want it, including smartphones, is really advanced. This means all these things can be brought together. That's what I was saying. It's a business model issue, and a lot of it is how do we get these technologies together in a way that gives the consumer information, helps them control the devices in their home.
Here's a really interesting question about carbon capture and sequestration. Several major projects have been either stopped or rescaled lately. What does that say about that technology? Are we ready for it? Is it feasible? This is for Bill, but anyone can chime in.
Well, I mean, carbon capture sequestration is, and I'd be interested in getting Will's point of view on this, but I mean, it's, and arguably is the most important technological advance that the globe needs to solve climate change, because whether the U.S. closes every single coal-fired power plant or not, China, India have enough coal-fired power plants in existence and building that they will continue to have, those plants' emissions will continue to influence the climate. So we have to figure out something. At the moment, if you're Duke Energy or you're AEP or you're one of the big companies that have plants, it is very difficult without a government mandate or any government signal to say, I'm going to spend, spend hundreds of millions of dollars to try and develop this technology. Individual installations on a plant may be as much as between $500 to $1 billion. An early capture technology may be up to a third of the output of the plant required to run the technology. So these are big things that are just not going to happen from the point of view of a ratepayer in Indiana or in North Carolina unless there's some other approach other than saying you're going to get to pay all this. And then switch to China. From what we can tell, and I know there are lots of experts probably in the room on this, but they seem to be very focused, yes on capture, no on sequestration, looking for beneficial reuse. If they come up with some sort of reuse first, they're going to, they're going to dominate the world market in what could be a huge new sector.
Interesting. Andrew?
Just briefly, if you bring up CCS, let's bring it up in the context of the portfolio where government money would go. Big Pole loves it, but anyone who studies the question of scale knows it will always cost money. And there's no evidence that the world is going to pony up to $50 or $100 a ton. From what we had in the meantime, look at our research budget for solar compared to CCS. Solar gets lost completely. We did a long story in the time me and I had all these about how the whole influence on the research portfolio is really quite toxic. If you care about the when you look at scale, doing CCS at scale, tell me anyone who says scale.
I guess that's not how this isn't a Duke position, but what I would say is I get what you're saying, and so we could be California and say here's a performance standard for all our power, and we'll wipe out will essentially say coal in the United States has to meet this performance standard, and so either you come up with a gizmo or you shut down. And we have an aging fleet of coal-fired power plants. That actually may not be, I hope there are no coal advocates in the room, but maybe that's where we're headed. That's not where China's India is headed. So either we're going to say we're not going to solve the climate issue, or we're going to discover that all those coal-fired power plants are not material to the climate problem. I don't see how you get to a climate solution without figuring out how to burn coal cleanly from a global point of view, and not as an advocate for Duke or as an advocate for the U.S. continued use of coal.
But, and Andrew's point, interesting, you're never going to burn coal cleanly unless there's some regulatory measure that's making that imperative. What will force regulatory change? This is another audience question. What will force regulatory change? Bill and anyone else who wants to chime in.
My background is more in the policies around air pollution, and we've gone from technology that was very expensive that caught 50% of sulfur dioxide to technology that captures 99.9% of sulfur dioxide from coal without at an acceptable energy penalty. So we do have that track record. That came from mandates being put on the industry with a far enough time frame that allowed the commercial innovation to occur, that vendors were out there selling us the products that would meet that. Maybe that's as simple as how, certainly the theory around a economy-wide cap and trade bill was this signal would create innovation, right, and would create solutions.
Yeah, but a pollution price. So but what's going to get us there? What's going to get us to? We failed at clearly recently. I know you're still smarting from the wound, but at getting that, at making that happen. The next 2 years are potentially a stalemate on that. And does anyone have any thoughts on what needs to happen to make that change, to get that price?
If you look at this as a continuum, I think a part of this is looking at the supply and demand and not just the supply side. So if you look at the demand side, and that's why our industry is so focused on how to ensure better use of energy in the home and in the buildings, something around well, it's a huge percentage. I'm not sure exactly what the percentage is, but the JESS study found a huge percentage of the energy usage is in is in buildings and in houses. So if there are ways to do that better, you're going to actually create less demand, and that actually helps with the issue of retiring plants that are older and that you no longer need. So part of it is trying to do something on the demand side and be more efficient on that. I think, and Bill may disagree with me, but I think also in his industry, on the regulatory side, there's certainly things that can be done on the regulation side of how they're regulated to help them have better incentives and give them tools that they can use to actually invest in ways that make more sense than they do today. It's harder for them, I think, to actually adjust to different kinds of energy uses because of the regulatory system. So changing that would help a lot. So I think it's a continuum. I think if you look at the demand side and the supply side and figure out ways that they can work together, I think over time we can reduce usage enough so you can actually start seeing ways to retire some of these plants and not have to worry as much about some of those issues about how to make the clean colder. I mean, it's not going to solve it, but it will help.
Yeah, to what Luke just said as well, the abstracting it up one level, one way to avoid gridlock is to not get into gridlock in our own heads, thinking that there is an automatic trade-off between doing what's right for the environment and doing something that makes fiscal sense and doing something that's profitable for the business community. A lot of folks that I talk to in their own mind think that there's this inherent antagonism in a very steep trade-off space where you can't trade one for the other. What Luke just described is a situation where it's a win-win for everyone. So coming up with ideas like that where you can do profitable things that make good business sense, that are also environmentally sound, that are also good policy, we can come up together irrespective of bipartisan issues with that convergence space and work within it. We don't have to have an inherent trade-off between these. So I think fundamentally getting into that attitude of there is a convergence space and finding it is the first step.
Yeah, and I think where that convergence space should be or has to be is around the idea that this is really not a political issue, it's an issue of American competitiveness. The reality is that all of these technologies are technologies which are going to enable us to have a competitive economy going forward. They're more efficient, they're more cost effective in the long term. There's a bunch of reasons why we need to go there. And the rest of the world sees it, and for some reason we're slow to see it in non-political terms. And you know, I think we have to come to grips with the fact that there's early wins, which are big opportunities, and if we can get capital to flow into those and unlock the opportunities there, then you'll see a lot of movement in energy efficiency and some of these technologies that are close to the tipping point. And then there's the long term. And I think that the issue is that you got to kind of separate it out. There's new build and there's retrofit, and the new build is easy. We can go out there, we can figure out how that's a growth part of the economy. Let's go and get that done. The hard part is the retrofit. What do we do with all these incumbent technologies with, you know, assets that are already in the ground? And, you know, from what we've seen in terms of carbon capture and technologies, you know, even when you start looking at retrofitting those plants, it's really the new build coal plants that are much more efficient and easy to do at a cost-effective rate. It's the retrofits that are challenging, and so I ultimately think you're going to have to come to grips with the fact that we need some sort of carbon legislation. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You're going to have to do that, and you're going to have to figure out how to do that cost-effectively and efficiently over a series of years in a way that we can phase out what we've already got and get to something that's more stable, more competitive.
So we end this panel as children begging for effective carbon legislation. I think, do we have just a couple more minutes? Where are we on time? 2 more minutes. Okay, well, great, because I have my final question, which is a bit of a curveball here. But I love the motto, jump and the net will appear. And you are all acrobats.
Whose motto is that?
Well, it's sort of a paraphrase of something I heard that it was never attributed to anyone, but I'll find out who said it first. But you're all these high-flying acrobats doing your tumbling without any nets. It's a very, obviously, very high-stress environment, very thrilling environment. How do you manage your stress? Is my question. And the reason why I ask this question is that Brian has a music label. Brian of Nanosolar has a music label. And said, you know, and some others in this audience, I won't name names, do have creative outlets for their very high-stress careers. So I was curious. I like this, the personal window into the minds of entrepreneurs who are doing these high-risk acrobatics. Bill and Link and Will and Brian, can you tell us a little bit about how you manage these high-risk lifestyles before we close?
You know, I'm old enough so I know I don't manage it. It manages me. I mean, no, I don't know. I have a 19-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 2-year-old. So that's all you needed to know about how wow. I think I just added to the stress. Yeah. Didn't subtract from it.
So I'm on the Verizon cell service, and so what I typically do is take out the Verizon coverage map of the world, and I go and try and find a place where it doesn't exist. And I take a vacation to that spot.
Good idea. Don't leave very many places to go on vacation. 2 things. I ran for office. So I'm a commissioner in my night job. I'm a town commissioner for the town I live in, which actually has been very interesting because we had about 2 years ago a hardware store owner come to us and want to put up a wind generating tower right in the middle of town. And so we had a whole go through, and we did go through a series of hearings about alternative energy systems because people now are starting to demand it. So you're seeing it all at the local level. A couple of one I'm put in solar panels in old buildings, and it didn't fit, so we figured out ways to do that as well. But so that was interesting. And the other thing is I actually do a lot of, I run 2 blogs. One is a political blog and one is a blog for the town. So we don't have a newspaper, so that's a way for people to get an outlet. And that's been very interesting because as a moderator of the blog, I certainly see a lot of things that I can't post and I have to go back to people and say, you know, if you take out the swear words, I can put that in, but not the way you've written it. Right. So it's a good outlet too, because I do see a lot of what people care about in the blog.
Brian, could you hum us one of your tunes?
You can go to iTunes and check it out. Brian Sager, please check it out. I would say that for me, music is a complement to what I do entrepreneurially because when you put a note on the page, it stays there. You don't have to compromise. You don't have to work out around issues. There's no experimental data. You don't have to raise money. You put the note there, and it just stays there. And that's kind of a nice feeling. So.
There's something permanent in the world.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much. And I wasn't able to ask all the questions, so please, everybody who asks questions, either give your question to the person you wrote it for, or just approach them after the panel. But thank you so much.